I'm calling this episode Revolutionary Roads, as we'll be discussing a quick history of Philadelphia's colonial past and its role in the American Revolution, as well as its pivotal role in the founding of the United States of America. To truly appreciate Philadelphia and plan your amazing adventure, it is important to journey through its history because it's what makes Philadelphia so unique and have so much character. Philadelphia is one of the oldest cities in America, and the location of the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and basically the birthplace of the United States, because it was where the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution were written, debated, and signed in 1776 and 1787, respectively. It's a story formed by a diverse blend of cultures from the Lenape Native Americans, the Quaker ideals of William Penn, and later waves of European immigrants who shaped its neighborhoods and industries. Understanding the history of Philadelphia really allows you to engage in what makes it so fascinating and fun. You'll find different neighborhoods that have been shaped from everything from the old Swedish culture to the European culture of the British in the colonial era, to modern culture, to what makes us American today. That's why we're starting our series, this episode, just focusing on the history. Next time, we'll really get into some of the sites to visit, right? We're getting started on our adventure. Time to travel back centuries, the beginning of it all. So, Philadelphia, as a point of reference, of course, is on the eastern coast of the United States, about midway up the Atlantic. And it's located near the confluence of the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers. This area has always been very important to Native American settlements because it's a very convenient access, obviously, to a port, as it still is today, to the ocean and river access, even going into like the Susquehanna and things like that, more inland. Prior to the European settlement, the area was inhabited by the Algonquin speaking Native Americans primarily, known as the Lenape. And they were a peaceful hunter gatherer people that were semi nomadic. Their descendants continue to live throughout Pennsylvania and the Northeast today. Europeans referred to the Lenape as the Delawares, given the tribe's proximity to the Delaware River basin. I will do a future post just on this culture because I think it's very interesting and fascinating, and we'll talk a little bit about that again in a moment. Then you have European exploration, which started in 1609. The first known European explorer was Henry Hudson, obviously, very famous explorer. He is known for, you think about the Hudson Bay is named after him. The Hudson River in New York is named after him. He was actually an English explorer, but he was recruited to work for the Dutch, and he sailed into the Delaware River and claimed it for Holland. He claimed it for the Dutch in 1609. Now, they didn't really do much with the land, but they were aware of it and technically claimed it. Uh, Subsequent Dutch navigators like Captain Cornelius Hendrickson came in 1616. Cornelius Jacobson came in 1623. And they continued to explore the area, but didn't really do much with it except have a couple of trading posts. They did trading with the Native Americans and things like that. And like 1633 was one they had up on the Schuylkill River. But pretty much, actually, it was the Swedish immigrants that truly were the first European settlers, permanent settlers in this area of Pennsylvania. The Dutch were up, in New York and called New Amsterdam, New York, Manhattan. So they were up there very early, but this area was actually settled originally by the Swedish who came over in 1638. Their first settlement was a place called Fort Christina, named after the Queen of Sweden, and it was right where present-day Wilmington, Delaware is. Now, if you look at the map, Wilmington, Delaware is really just across the river pretty much from Philadelphia. It's not far at all. I know when we were driving up from Raleigh, it was pretty much like we were in Wilmington, and then maybe like 30 minutes later, we were in Philadelphia. So they're kind of, it's not that far. They're not that far from each other. By 1643, the Swedes had actually moved into the area around Philadelphia, and you can still find traces of these Swedish settlements, surprisingly, uh, throughout Pennsylvania, this area of Pennsylvania, and many of their descendants are still in the area. There's still remnants of that, which is really cool. Lots of residents can trace their genealogy back to the original Swedish settlers. Within the Swedish community, there are also a mix of some Dutch immigrants that came over with the Swedes and Finnish settlers as well. They kind of all came together, but it was a Swedish government was who actually kind of initiated it with like a private enterprise, I believe, from my research. So you can actually still see, like I said, traces of these Swedish settlements in the area. And I did some research. One place you can visit that is directly tied to old Swedish settlers, even though it was founded technically when it had become an English part of the colony, um, is something called the Gloria Dei or the Old Swedes Church. It's actually in Philadelphia, and it was built by Swedish settlers beginning in like 1697, but it was completed in 1700. It was a place of worship and gathering. It was a Lutheran church for many years before it ended up becoming an Anglican and now Episcopalian church. It's interestingly enough, not only is it the oldest surviving brick building in Philadelphia, it is also the oldest church building in Pennsylvania, but even more remarkably, I found out it's the oldest active congregation in the United States. It's been continually active, Lutheran to Anglican to Episcopalian since 1700, which is remarkable. And they have a great website. You can take tours, join them for service. They welcome everyone, which sounds like a really cool place to visit on my next trip to Philadelphia. Hopefully, I can be there on Sunday and join them for service. Betsy Ross, interestingly enough, later on was married in this church. She actually was born a Quaker, fun fact, but temporarily became Anglican when she married her first husband, and then later became a Quaker again. Of course, all members of the Christian faith, just different denominations. But also something that else is really, I didn't know this prior to this research and this vacation we went on, is that one of the most important contributions from the Swedes in America was their introduction of the log house building technique. Now we think of Lincoln Logs. Every time I drive down I-40, they have these advertisements in North Carolina to buy Lincoln Log Home, or I've been to his log cabin, in like Illinois and Kentucky. But the American frontier, Little House on the Prairie, right? But actually, the first log homes, the Native Americans utilized log homes and they call them long houses as well. But kind of this traditional log cabin we think of actually originated with the Swedes, who brought over the design and kind of that building blueprint from Sweden. And you can actually see an example of this, not in Philadelphia, but it's just across the state line in New Jersey within maybe 45 minutes or so. It's called the C.A. Knocknangle Log House, and it's on the Swedesboro, Paulsboro Road in Gibbstown, New Jersey. It's still standing, and it's several hundred years old. It dates back to that original settlement, and it's one of the oldest original log houses, period, built in America. There are other log houses, of course, wooden houses built, but this kind of cabin style that we're used to. So I thought that was fascinating when I was researching how Sweden was actually, who would have thought it? We think of William Penn and the Dutch, but it was actually the Swedish population that originally kind of took Philadelphia as their colony. Now you're wondering, well, what happened to Sweden? Because we know Pennsylvania, many of us know from elementary school and middle school, high school, was settled by William Penn. He's a pretty famous guy, the Quaker Oat, right? Um, but actually, what happened is the Swedish population had about 300 families, 300 people. It really never got too big. And the Dutch were like, hey, we scouted this land before you guys were ever here. So we want it back. Typically, European battles, world battles, right? Land is land, and people want to take over land. So the Dutch actually ended up taking over New Sweden, and the rest is kind of history. So they took it over in 1655. It became part of New Netherland. They decided just to let the Swedish population kind of continue to control things the way they were doing it, that they had the ultimate like authority over the region. And then in 1664, the British decided to take over the Dutch colonies. They took over New York, which was New Amsterdam. Interesting post there. I won't dive into the details too much of that, but basically the British got it without too much of a fight because the person who was in charge of what we now know as Manhattan today, New Amsterdam, just kind of panicked. The British fleet came and just gave it over to England, which the Dutch tried to eventually get it back, but it stayed with England, and thus it became named New York after the Duke of York in England. Becoming Pennsylvania. So we're going to start learning, how did Pennsylvania become Pennsylvania? It did get incorporated into kind of the greater York, settlement per se for about 20 years. It just was part of the newly acquired New Amsterdam, aka New York. Once the British took it over, they then decided to kind of break apart the Dutch colony into several other colonies, and that's where William Penn comes in. But we'll kind of start with the beginning of his life because it'll give you a timeline to understand how Pennsylvania came to be in its modern form, origins. He was born in 1644 as William Penn. He was the son of a wealthy British admiral who, while attending Oxford, he felt called to join the Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers. They were emerging at that time. Quakers are Christians who advocate for pacifism and equality. So they're about peace. They believed in like religious tolerance and things like that. And at the time, it was considered very revolutionary. The Quakers was actually seen as like offensive to the state church, the Anglican church. So he was expelled from school and imprisoned for being a Quaker. His family connections luckily helped him because his father was very wealthy. He was a loyal British admiral, and he had retained influence in the king's court because of this, William Penn. King Charles actually owed Penn's father £16,000 as a repayment for a debt. And in order to repay that debt, instead of just paying him back with cash, he just said, "Hey, I'll give your son, William Penn, a charter for Pennsylvania, which, you know, will cover more than sufficiently cover this debt, and then I don't have to take any gold or silver out of my coffers to pay it." And if you kind of remember, I won't go too into depth on this, but just a timeline of history. Remember Charles the First, Charles II's father, he actually was beheaded by Cromwell, who kind of replaced the British government for a while with this kind of a mess. It was the British Civil War, and they did away with like Christmas and some other things. I won't get into the weeds with that, but it was an interesting kind of time run by some Puritans. And that being said, there was a lot of moving and shaking by the time Charles II came. So he ended up giving Pennsylvania to William Penn. And a lot of people would say, "Man, I got all this land. I'm gonna make some money." And obviously, he did care about being profitable. It's not that, but as a Quaker and as someone who really had been enlightened to understanding kind of the value of freedom of religion, especially after say the Civil War that they just been through and other things, he decided that he wanted to do something called a holy experiment. Um, because he was a ruler and proprietor of Pennsylvania, so basically the crown technically still own the colony per se, but it was really William Penn's. He was a Lord's proprietor per se. He really could have the freedom to govern the colony as he wished, as long as in the end they would do what Parliament needed them to do, right? So all he had to do was simply follow the laws he instituted to be in harmony with those of England, and he agreed to be, have a representative assembly within Pennsylvania. So he decided he wanted to create a colony espousing a refuge for religious freedom. William Penn called this the Holy Experiment, a province that would serve as a refuge, a place for religious freedom and also self government. And he advertised his colony throughout Europe, not just in England, offering 100 acres for 40 shillings. His promise of refuge appealed to other religious nonconformists, including the Amish, Moravians, Baptists, Catholics, Huguenots, Jews, Mennonites, and these groups all still form a huge cornerstone of what Pennsylvania is today. You think about the Amish country, which that will be a topic for a future video. Hopefully, I've done a few blog posts on my time in the Amish country, which is so interesting. We have a lot of Moravians here and Quakers in North Carolina who settled about the same time. But, you know, as a Catholic, it's very interesting for me to see, kind of the roots, and to have this holy experiment, right? So Penn arrived in the colony near what is Newcastle, Delaware, just across the river, really, not that far. Delaware isn't too far from Philadelphia in 1682. He then kind of moved up the Delaware and the Schuylkill rivers, and then he created Philadelphia, right where they converge. And he decided to name it Philadelphia, as many of us are aware, meaning the city of brotherly love or fraternal love, sisterly love. We will count that as well. One of the things he wanted to do that was unique up to that time in planning his city is he had witnessed the devastating Great Fire of London in 1666, which was terrible. I mean, it took out tons and tons of houses. It devastated the city. And fires, of course, in those days, especially with the houses, a lot of them were built with, wood. If they weren't done properly, the streets were too close together. It could terrorize a whole street, a whole neighborhood. We recently, unfortunately, saw, how dangerous fires could be in like California, even with modern engineering. But William Penn, because of this, really wanted to have what he envisioned as a green country town, a wholesome setting where citizens could live safely, free from the threat of similar destruction. And because he realized one of the issues in London was that the streets were too narrow, the houses were too close together. They didn't really have enough trees and green spaces to kind of offset some of this. So he created this whole city grid. He was one of the first cities in America to be based on a grid system. In fact, I think from my research, it was the first. So he collaborated with architect Thomas Holmes to design this innovative city structure based on a grid system, which is still pretty much the system of the main downtown and city core today. You can actually walk the same streets, some of the same names he had, which were named after a lot of trees and also like first, second type streets as well. And I'm verifying, yes, it was the first city in the United States to implement this organized layout, which is very popular in cities today. The streets were intersecting at right angles. 5 centrally located public squares is also really important. He wanted to have a safe, nice place where you have public squares. You could have community and natural beauty, which I found out several of these squares are still in existence today. They've been renamed. But for instance, I know, just double checking my notes here, Washington Square, Rittenhouse Square, Logan, Franklin, and Center Square were all originally the same squares of Penn's design. He had 5 squares and 4 of them still remain. So that is pretty cool. They've just been renamed and, of course, remodeled for our modern needs, but they're still there in public green spaces. So William Penn was very progressive for his time. That doesn't mean he was perfect, but he was progressive and tried to do the best by all people in the way he knew how, given his era. One thing he wanted was peace and harmony with the native Lenape. That was very important to him. So prior to his arrival, he actually went ahead and sent gifts to the Lenape. He learned several Indian dialects, so he was able to actually speak with them, negotiate with them, have partnership with them. He also was introduced to law, given to that their kind of laws and culture, so he could understand it. When he created his court system and legislative system within Pennsylvania, he wanted fairness for everyone, no matter what your belief system, Jewish, Catholic, Quaker, um, you know, and also the Native Americans. He made sure that they had a fair trial and due process and dispute with European settlers. Like the European settlers just wouldn't automatically win, or he wanted them to have a fair and equal trial, which is still something that we discuss today, right? It's very important and part of our Bill of Rights, essentially. And he also wanted to make sure when they had this trial that there were equal number of natives and colonists on the jury, so it wasn't, swayed either way. Um, the only issue is he did not give them citizenship status, but really was very progressive at the time in how he dealt with and tried to work with Lenape. Not have a lot of time today because I want to give it its just due for this amazing culture and native people that are still here today. But what I'll do is I'll post the official tribe website in the comments section, and then I'll work on in the next couple of weeks doing a blog post or a blog specifically on their culture, and taking time to really appreciate it because they were so fundamental to Philadelphia, to the early roots of this colony, and the exchange of ideas and information too with the Europeans. All right. So we kind of set up William Penn. He's created this holy experiment. Of course, not everything's perfect, but overall, it really attracted a lot of different cultures and powerful thinkers eventually to Philadelphia who wanted to partake in this holy experiment for a better life. So by the time the American Revolution rolled around, Philadelphia, guided by Penn's holy experiment, was considered one of the most sophisticated and diverse cities in the colonies. It also had one of the largest populations. It boasted a thriving intellectual community. It was a port city as well, so you were getting a lot of ideas and exchange of ideas and cultures, and obviously population who were choosing to be there because of the trade and the business opportunities and things like that, which makes it very interestingly culturally to study, the colonial roots of Philadelphia. Charleston, in a way, was very similar, as they were. That's where my family was originally from, so I kind of see parallels there in terms of some religious tolerance and also being a port city, how it could kind of bring in education and things like that. Now, one of the leading citizens, of course, we are all familiar with Benjamin Franklin. He was actually originally born in Boston and apprenticed with his brother, his older brother in Massachusetts. He loved his brother, but I don't think he really kind of wanted to set out on his own, so he left his apprenticeship early. And he just fled to Philadelphia, still maintained friendship with his brother, but he's like, time to start my own business. I believe it was in the 1730s when he arrived in Philadelphia. And he started his own printing press and kind of became a self-made man, very famous with his Poor Richard's Almanac and some of his other publications. He was known as what you would call a polymath, meaning he could do so many different things. And he had a lot of different interests from science. We all hear about the lightning rod and those experiments, eyeglasses, things like that. Also interested in like political science, of course, and he became very prominent in the city and a leading citizen, always trying to figure out better ways to do things and to provide, of course, the best commentary and practical common sense with his publications, right? Uh, we'll do a feature on Franklin and historic sites tied specifically to his life and times in Philadelphia in a future post because it's just so much. He's done so much in Philadelphia. Helped start the American Philosophical Society, University of Pennsylvania. Believe it or not, he was the first one to recommend having a volunteer fire department, the first one like in the United States. He helped with that. So the Firemen's Museum in Philadelphia actually has like a statue, or a Firemen's Memorial has a statue dedicated to Benjamin Franklin. So there's so much to study with him, but I bring him up because he's just one of many really great thinkers and citizens who were in Philadelphia, which kind of made it the perfect melting pot and foundation for kind of what would happen in its role in the American Revolution. All right, so we're going to get into moving from the colonial era into the building of a new nation, United States of America. So you may be wondering, why did suddenly after, over 100 years of being peacefully aligned with Britain as a colony, did Pennsylvania and other colonies suddenly decide that they were ready to kick Great Britain to the curb and fight for independence? And it's something that the more you dig into, the more it feels relevant to kind of our lives today and the importance of our rights, questions about government and their role in our life, things like that. So up until 1765, the colonies considered themselves proud British citizens. They were active in providing goods and services for trade and industry. That's how they, saw themselves. Hey, we don't live in England, but we're part of England. We're part of the mother country in the empire because we're getting them tar, from the Carolinas that they can use for shipbuilding. We're the tobacco, the goods and services they need. We're helping our nation, our mother country. They were proud British citizens, and they saw themselves as British. If anything, they were always trying to import the latest fashions and China and things from the continent because they saw themselves as British. But they also realized they had their own unique identity as Americans. But that was secondary to their British identity. All seemed to be going pretty well. They had some disputes. There were some issues, conflicts, usually with land disputes with Native Americans and the French. So England got embroiled in some wars kind of in the 1750s on the continent with the French and a few other of her allies. And it spread over to America in 1756. It was known as the 7 Years' War in England and the French and Indian War in America. In the United States, the conflict really came from the fact that the Ohio River Valley and some other French-controlled areas, because you remember they settled in Quebec and heck, even all the way up to like Minnesota. On my blog, AmericanNomadTraveler.com, we visited Minnesota a few years ago near Duluth up to Grand Portage, and that area was heavily settled by the French very early on in the 1600s, which is interesting. So as they're going into, more colonists are wanting to move into Ohio Valley region, the French are kind of frustrated. There's all these kind of tensions, and war broke out. And the French and their Indian allies fought the British and their Indian allies. They all had different reasons, usually about land, naming rights, bragging rights, all of that. And many colonists, they were ready to fight. They said, "This is our homeland. Britain is our mother country. Let's volunteer. Let's serve as loyal citizens, fighting alongside of our British brothers from England, including George Washington, who was one of the men who served in the French and Indian War. And he was actually there when they fired the first shot. I forget the name of the battle, but in the French and Indian War, one of the first actual battles of the war. And this actually is interesting because a lot of the Continental Army later on were not ragtag soldiers. Some of them were, especially from the militias, but they served and learned from British artillery and military practices from fighting in the French and Indian War. So this war actually kind of ended up training the Continental Army when they fought against the British years later, which is interesting, including George Washington. The war ended. I say we won, but really the British won, right? Quebec had to go to England. It became part of British a British colony. Everything basically east of the Mississippi became British. The French still controlled like Louisiana, which eventually we was sold later on by Napoleon to Thomas Jefferson in like 1803. But you know, kind of everybody got a little piece of the pie, but the British basically lost. Everybody was happy, except Parliament, because Parliament and the people in England realized, man, that war cost a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And, I'm in England and I'm having to pay all this taxes for this war that took place over in a whole nother part of it. I mean, yeah, they're British, but they live way over 3,000 miles away. Uh, I know we were fighting over here too in the continent, but I mean, this is ridiculous. These taxes on us is ridiculous. They need to pay their fair share. This is kind of how this came to be. And Parliament decided, you know what? We really need to have the British as our colonies over there pay their fair share. We did such a wonderful thing going on and helping them to fight the French, to help them to get access to Ohio River Valley. This is their mindset, and somewhat I can see their perspective, right? It some of it makes sense. But if you look at the American perspective, let's consider this. They fought too. They gave their lives. It was their land too, and they're British citizens. Doesn't their sacrifice by basically being in a war zone for 7 years and fighting this war amount to anything? The British would argue, yes, but now because there's still issues with threats of the French maybe eventually trying to retake some of this land, or their Native American Indian allies also kind of having incursions on the frontier, what they called the frontier back then, we're going to have permanent military operations just to kind of maintain things at these forts. That's very expensive. So you guys need to pay for that. Americans thought, well, hold on a second. We can have militias and we'll tax our own militias and pay for them with our own legislatures. Parliament doesn't have to worry about that. These are the types of things that are going on before the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act. Sugar Act was in 1764, but the Stamp Act really made it go over. So up until that point, the colonies were not taxed directly by Britain. Obviously, taxes were paid in other ways, mostly through their colonial legislatures. But the reason why they were not taxed is because they did not have direct representation in Parliament. And one of the rights of British citizenship was that you could not be taxed without parliamentary representation. The colonies were taxed, like I said, by their local legislatures. That's where their local representatives, that's who they paid their taxes to. And of course, depending on how the colony was set up, if it was a Commonwealth, Lords Proprietor, whatever it was, then eventually Britain would get their funds or their benefit from it, right? But the taxing was not done directly because there was no parliamentary representation, which is still a big thing for us today. That's sort of no taxation without representation. Wasn't even not paying the tax, but So this Stamp Act actually was pretty common for the British in England, but it was revolutionary in America. And it basically put a direct tax or tariff on colonists, requiring a stamp to be placed, a physical stamp actually, on various printed materials, including legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, a lot of things that you wouldn't even think would be important until you need them. Like to do, say you wanted to, I'm giving an example, like you had a court case, you want to buy property, things like that, minor things, legal documents. It was a pretty substantial tax. But in all honesty, it was pretty common for British citizens living in England to pay a stamp type tax. They actually had their own version of the stamp tax. But colonists, because they didn't have representation in Parliament, said, when this isn't fair, we can't negotiate, our rights here because we don't have representation. Plus, we pay taxes already to our legislatures. In addition, they felt that the Stamp Act that they were paying was a lot higher than the ones paid in Britain. They said, well, if you're going to charge us, at least make it be the same as Britain, right, in England. And they were upset. They'd also felt they paid their dues for fighting and sacrifices made during the conflict. As I also said, they didn't really want to have a British standing army presence because they felt their local militias, they could tax them, still would be paying for it, but they could tax them through their legislatures and cover the need. So it all goes back to this lack of representation, no taxation without representation. Protests broke out across the country, of course, Boston, Philadelphia. If you follow AmericanNomadTraveler.com, we visited Brunswick Town in North Carolina recently on the coast, and they had actually the first Stamp Act protest, armed protest in the country in November 1765. So it was made everybody mad, especially if you were doing business or you were a port city. Bad for business. And you felt violated because you're like, hey, I thought we were friends. I thought we were family. I thought we were citizens. So for the first time, they started to question, are we like second class citizens? So you think that British Parliament, where they kind of made an error, is instead of just realizing maybe went about this the wrong way, like maybe we should offer representation in Parliament, maybe we should figure out a different way to do this. They did they did away with the Stamp Act in 1766 because of all the protesting, but it was kind of like passive aggressive. I'm going to get rid of it, and they ended up just really continuing to do things that would make the colonists mad and show that they were not citizens of the same value as those in England. They enacted the Townshend Act, which was much hated in 1767. The Tea Act, of course, familiar. Many of us are familiar with that, with the Boston Tea Party. That ended up leading to many Tea Party protests, not just in Boston, also Eaton, North Carolina had one, Philadelphia had one. Problem is all of those Tea Party protests, they had valid concerns, but instead of once again just saying, okay, they're mad, we made them mad, they're acting out, let's find a solution, cooler heads prevail. No. So much economic damage had been done from the Boston Tea Party, especially like tons and tons, but heck, millions of dollars. I don't know the exact amount in modern day money, but it would be, a lot of money was lost. That they decided instead of showing leniency for colonial colonist rights and try to figure out a solution, Parliament said no. We're going to close the port of Boston, and they enacted the Intolerable Act. And this really was kind of the final nail in the coffin, which sealed the deal into really rising the tensions beyond turning back. So in 1774, tensions were rising. They chose Philadelphia, the Continental, members of all the colonies, representatives who were elected, to meet in Philadelphia at the Carpenter Hall, which is still in Philadelphia today. We're gonna do a little discussion on that in a future vlog. They met there in 1774 to figure out how we can respond to these intolerable acts. Like, we're British citizens, we're being mistreated. We need to be very mindful. We want to have dialogue with Britain, but we need to figure out a plan. What can we do? Especially with the port of Boston being closed and other things. It was really threatening trade throughout the colony. So during the First Continental Congress, the focus was really working on a peaceful approach to overturn the unfair, intolerable act and to get, full rights of citizens. So, hey, get Britain to see the light. We really just want to just wake up. Don't you see our perspective here? Help us. They endorsed the Suffolk Resolve, which was really kind of one of the most important things they did during this First Continental Congress. It called for non-compliance with the Intolerable Acts and a refusal on British goods. And it also said they could form a militia. The states could form a militia, which is interesting. Because, as I said, that was one of the things that Britain was trying to say. They had to have a standing army and why they were taxing them. Now, if you're thinking about some of this stuff, I don't want to get too political, but some of this stuff similar to things that you see on the news today, and you can kind of imagine yourself as a citizen back then and even today. And luckily today we have our Constitution, right? And we have our Bill of Rights. So these are things that they were kind of fighting for too back then, because they were realizing some of those rights that they thought they had, they were not having access to, like representation in Parliament. On October 14th in 1774, this First Continental Congress also created a declared rights and grievances of the Intolerable Act, which they submitted to British Parliament, hoping that they would finally understand their complaints. Didn't work, of course, unfortunately. And they also, on October 20th, 1774, created the First Continental Congress, created what they called the Continental Association, which called for a complete ban on trade between America and Great Britain of all goods, wares, and merchandise. So kind of feels a little familiar in 2025, the crazy things that happen, but understand why they did that. And problem is that only made both sides angry. They were kind of pushed to that because Britain wasn't listening to them. And of course, when you just do a boycott, at that point, you think Britain would finally say, okay, let's make a deal. But it eventually ended up in war as Parliament was thinking, oh, this petulant child, we've done so much for them. We're the mother country, and yet you're doing this. We need to basically reprimand you. At least that was George III's logic. Not everybody in Parliament actually felt that way. A lot of Parliament was actually sympathetic to the colonists, if you dig into that, which is interesting. So 1775, the fires of rebellion were just but a fire spark from igniting. And on April 19th, 1775, the American Revolution began with a kind of shot heard around the world. You've heard that expression. But the first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord. Nobody knows if it was Britain or British or American troops actually. It was, or if it was even intentional. But we went into war, right? And we'll be deep diving into a lot of this American Revolution timeline and learning stories about it from a new series I'm also doing on American Nomad to celebrate America's 250th anniversary. So keep, like and subscribe for that, because that is something, as I've mentioned before, and you can tell probably from this, I'm very passionate about the Revolutionary War. And I'm bringing all of this in because you're like, what does this have to do with Philadelphia? But, once those first shots were fired near Boston, everybody's realizing this isn't just a Boston problem. Their ports closed. This isn't going to affect all of the colonies. Like, we're not just independent colonies, independent, as eventually states. Like, we really need to be, like, we're really one. A lot of our issues, as different as we are, is different as our trade and our goals and our backgrounds are. Like, we have a common enemy now. This is not cool. So they decided, well, what can we do? At this point, we're in a war. We don't really want to be in a war necessarily. The goal was originally still to try to make peace with England. So on May 10th, 1775, a Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia at the Philadelphia State House to discuss the growing hostilities. Delegates like John Hancock of Massachusetts, he was the presiding officer. He and John Adams both proposed that George Washington, with his experience in the French Indian War, as well as he was a surveyor, he was a gentleman planter, very smart, cool-headed. They nominated him to be in charge of a continental army because they realized they did need an army until they sorted things out with England. The Continental Congress initially, as I said, worked for peace with Great Britain. They even, in July 1775, sent King George III an olive branch petition, really entreating peace and an end to the fighting. But George III, unfortunately, was mad. He was a little mad, but he was very, like I said earlier, saw us as being very petulant. He was the father figure. He wasn't going to give in to our entreaties and pleas, so he refused it. And after that, pretty much, there's a few other times they tried to make peace and to have like kind of that olive branch, but it didn't work out, right? So you're thinking, well, it's been a whole year before they declared independence officially. Well, yeah, because they were still trying to work out that peace with England. Because you have to think, at the time, that is a big deal to declare independence from one of the biggest superpowers in the world. A lot of people still really liked a lot of things about being British. They saw themselves as British. It hurt to have to leave. And in fact, during the war, only about one third of citizens of the United States were pro patriot, a third were loyalists, and a third were neutral. So it was very complicated because there's so many competing factors. But, and we're going to do a whole learn more about this in our Independence Hall um, feature. But on July 2nd, 1776, finally the Continental Congress declared independence. You're thinking, wait, I thought it was July 4th. Well, that's when they actually officially declared it. They read the in, independence, a Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson. They had to make a few tweaks and amendments. So it was formally approved, all the amendments and changes to the actual declaration itself on July 4th, right in Philadelphia at Independence Hall, which at the time was the State House of Philadelphia. And we're going to talk about that in our next post, actually, our next blog. We're going to do a visit there, and it won't be as long as this podcast, but there's so much to cover in this one. I will say that I am so proud that two of my ancestors actually signed the Declaration of Independence. My cousin was Thomas Jefferson on my dad's side, distant cousin. So my direct ancestor, Thomas Hayward Jr. of South Carolina, signed the Declaration of Independence. I thought it was interesting to kind of share his story, how he came to that. He became an advocate for independence because he studied in England at the Middle Temple, and that was a law school. And he always felt like he was a British citizen, but when he got over there, he realized that the English really saw the colonists as second class citizens. They didn't really respect their freedom, didn't respect them in the same capacity. Kind of like they were, the cousins like you invite to the wedding, but you don't really want to sit with them, kind of. That's a bad example, but you get what I mean. And he ended up being led to independence. He had a lot to lose by becoming a patriot. He was a wealthy planner. He was an attorney in Charleston. Um, and he knew that, if he signed this, like he could be killed. Like you could be executed for treason, right? Actually, he ended up though. He didn't let that get him down. He didn't lose the fight. Actually, when Charleston was captured by the British in 1780, he ended up in prison for a time with fellow signer Edward Rutledge from South Carolina. And even then, they said he kept up his spirits by humming British "God Save the King," but doing it with like "God Save George Washington" or like making up other lyrics that were patriotic. And thankfully, he was finally released after being in St. Augustine, Florida. But I just kind of wanted to bring that in because this wasn't something that people who signed the Declaration of Independence, yes, they weren't all, there are all these other issues involved with their lives, and they took a lot. It took a lot to sign or even to be present in the Continental Congress. So we're going to wrap up today. I know this is a little bit longer, but this is so important to laying the foundation to what we're going to be doing in our future podcast, which will be a little shorter visits in each place. But Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War played a major part. Obviously, it was the capital city for the American patriots. Um, and the British were in New York, and that was something that Washington was constantly trying to retake. But they were mostly in Philadelphia. But actually, in 1777, after the Battle of Brandywine, General Lord Howe of Britain, he temporarily took over Philadelphia from the Continental Army for 9 months, during which time the British occupied the city. They actually used Independence Hall, aka the State House of Pennsylvania. They used it to house prisoner of war from the Continental side. And I'll kind of backtrack here because I think it's important to realize, well, this Philadelphia is very strongly patriotic. It was where the Declaration of Independence was signed. There are often many residents who were loyalists and some that were neutral. Quakers in general are pacifists. They do not believe in war for religious reasons. So you had factions of Quakers. Some Quakers were like even Nathaniel Greene, he ended up becoming a general, right? He was from Rhode Island, but who felt the need to fight. Then you have like one of my other ancestors on my mom's side of the family from New York, the Townsend family. He was a spy because he wasn't going to actively be fighting, as a Quaker. But you have all these different factions. But some of the Quakers actually sided with the British because they just felt like that was the easiest way not to have war. So kind of, taking over Philadelphia during that time, some of the loyalists were very happy. Obviously, the Patriots fled. The Continental Army at that time ended up fleeing first to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which I did a blog post about fabulous Lancaster, so much history there a couple weeks ago. And then eventually to York, Pennsylvania for about 9 months before they finally were able to get back to Philadelphia. Now it's interesting, real quick before we wrap up today, that during this time, the Shippen family was very loyal to the crown. They're a very wealthy kind of merchant family in Philadelphia. During that time when the British were there, they hosted John Andre, who would later be one of the British operatives who was working with Benedict Arnold, who became, that notorious traitor who served America and betrayed his country and nation, right? But John Andre, he was actually pretty well respected, but he ended up being captured and killed um, in this whole plot later on, and that didn't happen in Philadelphia. But I think it's interesting because Peggy Shippen ended up marrying Benedict Arnold. They met when the Patriots recaptured Philadelphia. He was recovering from some wounds from the Battle of Saratoga, and they ended up connecting. And while I'm not going to go deep into that in this post, there's a lot of speculation that she kind of turned his ear. Although I think you have to choose that yourself, right? But after 1781, the Battle of Independence was won essentially at Yorktown. I won't say that General Cornwallis surrendered because he refused to meet George Washington because he said he was sick to his stomach. But essentially, he was fully defeated and they surrendered. Eventually, the war ended formally in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. It took a while to get the British to fully leave, and to obviously you had to have that treaty to formally end the war. After the American Revolution, Philadelphia would continue to be an epicenter of trade and eventually hosted in politics. For a while, New York was the capital, but in 1787, Philadelphia once again became the center of America because it was selected at Independence Hall, State House, Pennsylvania, to host the Constitutional Convention in 1787. We're really going to deep dive into this in our National Constitution Center video and podcast. But essentially, in between the end of the war and, well, actually, 1777 until, 1777 to 1787, we used the Articles of Confederation as our early government. Lots of issues with the Articles of Confederation. An ability to tax in certain ways, manage trade. There was currency in every state that was different, things like that. So it needed to be overturned, and this Constitutional Convention was really what they call a miracle in Philadelphia, because the fact that it even happened, I mean, they weren't really just supposed to redo the Articles of Confederation, not completely throw it away. They were supposed to tweak it, right? But they realized we needed a better form of government. And that's how our Constitution, which is still very important today and something that we strive to keep fighting for, was birthed in 1787. So stay tuned. We'll learn more about that in future posts as we visit Independence Hall, learn about the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention, followed by a trip to the National Constitution Center. I appreciate you for traveling with me through Philadelphia's early history. I know it was a lot, but hopefully it was interesting. Subsequent posts, I'll try to keep it to about 10 to 15 minutes, but like I said, these early posts really want to build you in a good foundation for the history of this amazing city and propel us forward on our Revolutionary War and adventures and beyond. Thanks so much.
Some say I take too many shots in the dark. I'm just trying to ignite a spark. Baby, I'm a fearless dreamer.